There is a moment, somewhere between the ages of 2 and 4, when almost every child on Earth is handed the same quiet test. A treat sits on the table. An adult says wait. And what happens in the next 60 seconds of that child's small, churning mind will echo for the rest of their life. In most places, that moment ends in tears, in reaching, in a small storm of frustration that a parent rushes to calm. But in Japan, something different has been happening in that same 60 seconds for centuries, and the difference is not luck, and it is not temperament. It is architecture. It is a quiet, deliberate psychological architecture, built into homes, classrooms, meals, and even silence itself, and it produces something researchers have spent decades trying to name. They call it the discipline of amae, the art of waiting without breaking. To understand how this works, you have to start somewhere unexpected, which is not with discipline at all, but with closeness. Japanese infancy looks, on the surface, almost indulgent. Babies are carried constantly, they sleep beside their parents, they are rarely left to cry alone, and for the first years of life there is very little of the structured independence training that defines early childhood in much of the Western world. No sleep training in the way it is commonly practiced elsewhere, no rush toward a separate room, a separate bed, a separate self. Psychologists have a term for this style, amae, a word that resists direct translation but roughly means a sanctioned, culturally supported dependence, the right to lean on another person and be received without judgment. It sounds, at first, like the opposite of self-control. How could total dependence produce a child capable of extraordinary patience? The answer lies in what that early dependence actually builds. When a child's needs are met consistently and without drama, something happens at the level of the nervous system that most people never think about. The body learns, before the mind can even form a memory of it, that distress is temporary and that comfort is reliable. This is the foundation of what attachment researchers call a secure base, and it turns out to be the single most important ingredient in a person's later capacity to tolerate frustration. A child who trusts, on a cellular level, that discomfort ends and safety returns, does not need to fight discomfort with panic. They can simply wait it out, because their body already knows how the story ends. In this light, the seemingly indulgent early years of Japanese childhood are not the opposite of discipline. They are its prerequisite. You cannot ask a nervous system to sit calmly with frustration if that nervous system has never learned that frustration passes. This is where the real transition begins, and it happens with a suddenness that surprises a lot of outside observers. Somewhere around age 3, the closeness of infancy starts to be paired, very deliberately, with expectations of self-restraint. Not through punishment. Not through lecture. Through ritual. Japanese preschools, for instance, are famous among early childhood researchers for a philosophy called Mimamoru, which translates loosely as watching over, or protective observation. Teachers are trained to resist the urge to intervene the moment a child struggles. If a group of 4-year-olds is having a conflict over a toy, the adult does not rush in to solve it. She stands nearby, present but silent, letting the children sit inside the discomfort of the disagreement for a beat longer than most Western caregivers would ever allow themselves to tolerate. That extra beat is not neglect. It is the entire curriculum. It is the child's brain being given the rare, repeated opportunity to generate its own solution to distress, rather than outsourcing that solution to an adult. This pattern shows up again and again once you know what to look for. Consider the ritual of the Japanese school lunch, kyuushoku, which is nothing like the cafeteria system found in most other countries. Children do not walk through a line and receive a tray. Instead, students themselves, wearing little white coats and caps, serve the food to their classmates, portioning it out, carrying trays, setting tables. And critically, no one eats until everyone is served and the class says itadakimasu together. Think about what that structure actually demands of a hungry 6-year-old. The food is visible. The smell is present. The body wants to eat now. And yet the ritual requires that same child to hold that wanting, in full view of the object of their desire, until the entire group is ready. This is instant gratification made structurally impossible, not through a parent's rule, but through a communal expectation the child has absorbed as simply how the world works. Researchers who study self-regulation call this kind of setup an external scaffold for internal control, and it is remarkably effective, because the child is not fighting their impulse alone. The whole room is waiting together. The waiting itself becomes a shared, almost social experience rather than an isolated battle of will. Now layer onto this the Japanese relationship with silence, because this might be the single most psychologically potent piece of the whole system. In many households and classrooms, silence is not treated as an absence to be filled. It is treated as a presence in its own right, something with its own value, its own weight. The concept of ma, which literally refers to a pause or an interval, whether in speech, in music, or in physical space, is taught almost aesthetically. Children are exposed, from a young age, to environments where nobody rushes to fill quiet moments with chatter, where a teacher might ask a question and then simply wait, sometimes for what feels like an uncomfortably long time to an outside observer, before a student answers. That waiting is not accidental. It is training the nervous system to tolerate an unresolved moment without needing to escape it through noise, movement, or distraction. Contrast this with environments where silence triggers immediate anxiety, where children and adults alike reach for a phone, a comment, a joke, anything to close the gap the second it opens. A child raised inside ma learns something different. They learn that a pause is not a problem. It is simply a space. And a person who is not afraid of empty spaces, almost by definition, a person who does not panic under delay. There is a physiological story underneath all of this, and it is worth pausing on because it explains why these rituals work at the level of brain development rather than just behavior. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, delayed gratification, and emotional regulation, is famously one of the last regions to fully mature, often not finishing its development until the mid-20s. But the pathways that will eventually make up a strong, efficient prefrontal cortex are laid down far earlier, through repeated practice. Every single time a child sits with a frustrating feeling and does not immediately act on it, whether that is waiting for a meal, waiting through a silence, or waiting for a turn, the neural circuitry that governs self-control gets a small rehearsal. Do this hundreds of times a week, embedded invisibly into daily rituals rather than delivered as isolated lessons, and by the time a child reaches school age, self-regulation is not something they have to consciously perform. It has become structural. It has become, in a very real sense, a habit of the brain itself, the same way a well-worn hiking trail becomes the easiest path through a forest, simply because it has been walked so many times before. This is strikingly different from how patience is often taught elsewhere, where it tends to appear as an isolated instruction rather than an environmental default. A parent says wait your turn, in a single moment, in a single sentence, and expects the child to summon self-control on command, from a kind of psychological vacuum. But willpower deployed in isolation, without any surrounding structure to support it, is exhausting, and it depletes quickly, which is exactly what decades of self-regulation research has found. The famous delayed gratification experiments of the 1960s, in which children were left alone with the treat and asked not to eat it, revealed that raw willpower alone was a fragile predictor of later outcomes. What mattered far more was strategy, environment, and practice habit. The children who succeeded were rarely the ones gritting their teeth the hardest. They were the ones who had, consciously or not, developed techniques for making the wait bearable, distraction, reframing, trust in the promised reward. Japanese cultural rituals essentially hand children these techniques for free, built into daily life, before the child is even old enough to know they are learning a technique at all. There is also a quieter, more social dimension to this that deserves attention, because it changes the emotional flavor of the entire experience. In many patience-building traditions elsewhere, waiting is framed individually. It is your turn to wait, your responsibility to control yourself, your failure if you cannot. In the Japanese context, waiting is far more often framed communally. The whole class waits for lunch. The whole train car waits in orderly, silent lines, an image famous enough that footage of Japanese train platforms has circulated worldwide, rows of commuters standing in exact formation, calm, unhurried, entirely without the pushing and jostling common elsewhere. Children absorb this atmosphere before they can articulate it. They are not fighting their impulses alone against the world. They are participating in a shared, almost rhythmic social choreography where everyone is waiting together, and there is something deeply regulating about that shared experience. Psychologists studying co-regulation have found that a calm surrounding environment can literally lower a child's physiological stress response, their heart rate, their cortisol levels, simply through proximity to other calm people. A child waiting inside a sea of calm adults is neurologically borrowing that calm, the way one tuning fork will begin to hum in sympathy with another place nearby. None of this is to say the process is without its costs, and it is worth being honest about that, because no cultural system produces pure upside. Researchers and even Japanese parents themselves have pointed out that this same emphasis on communal restraint can, in certain contexts, tip into excessive self-suppression and unwillingness to express needs or dissatisfaction even when expression would be healthy, a phenomenon sometimes discussed under the term enryo, a kind of reflexive holding back that can, in adulthood, make it difficult to ask directly for what one wants. The very neural pathways that make a person remarkably composed under frustration can also make it harder for that same person to advocate loudly for themselves when advocacy is exactly what is needed. Like most powerful psychological tools, patience cuts both ways, and understanding its mechanism is not the same as declaring it flawless. But strip away the cultural specifics for a moment, and what remains is a genuinely useful blueprint, one that applies far beyond any single country or tradition. The mechanism that turns a frustrated toddler into a composed, resilient child is not a single trick, and it is certainly not punishment. It is the layering of several ingredients, in a particular order. First, an early foundation of reliable comfort, so the nervous system learns that discomfort is temporary. Second, gradually increasing, low-stakes opportunities to sit with frustration, delivered through ritual and repetition rather than lecture. Third, an environment where silence and pause are treated as normal rather than something to be anxiously filled. And fourth, a communal structure, so the child is never waiting entirely alone, but rather practicing patience alongside others who model that same calm. Put these four ingredients together, repeated daily across thousands of small unremarkable moments, a meal here, a silence there, a shared line, a watched but not rescued conflict, and what emerges over years is not a child who has been taught to suppress frustration through sheer force of will. It is a child whose very architecture of the brain has been shaped, gently and repeatedly, to meet frustration with steadiness instead of collapse. That is the real psychological power hiding inside these traditions. Not a rule about waiting. A rewiring of what waiting even feels like.